an indigenous cause, Sterling Knox, Sajijak Dudame, Nagaji Budong and Dunjaba, Minawaki Da. My name is Sterling Knox. I come by way of Fond du Lac in Minnesota, and I am a first-year PhD student at Marquette. This is my preliminary, research into addiction and agency. And now that I have a broad picture of the literature and what's out there in terms of addiction and agency, this is serves as sort of like the groundwork for a possible dissertation topic, and at the very least, doctoral qualifying paper / possible publication. But there's a lot out there in here. So my interest in this comes from my community. Like a lot of communities, there's opioid crisis. Just to spitball a number, like 8 out of 10 people probably that I grew up with have had, struggles with addiction. And as a philosopher, the way that we construe agency is problematic for me a lot of ways. It's convenient for idealized notions, of or economic systems and legal systems. But also, when I went home, my ninja Shin, I asked him, I was like, so people tend to see addiction as a sort of loss of the sense of loss of a sense of self. And he responded, he was like, so how could they lose themselves without us? Because when they do good, they thank us because they couldn't have done it without us, which was kind of sobering in the middle of all this heady research that I was trying to do. So with that said, agency is broadly construed, as one's capacity of self-directed action, the capacity to act on one's own volition, making free choices. Agency is central to debates on how we conceptualize addiction. Like agency, addiction does not manifest in a vacuum. Social, political, economic forces shape who we are and determine what options are available to us as a member of a given community. The conditions in which we live, the option sets present heavily impact how we make choices. Given the importance of the social context of agency, I hold, along with many, there is a responsibility inherent to community to maintain conditions such that reinforce one's successful participation in that community. So in addiction literature, agency can be located somewhere between two poles, rational choice model and a disease model. Rational choice model assumes in addiction both an initial choice that led to addiction as well as the choice to recover while being an addicted person. Disease models maintain the agency is undermined due to determinate biological mechanisms preventing addicted persons from choosing otherwise. AA and NA are paradigmatic examples of the disease model, given the foundational belief that addicted person is powerless with regard to addiction. Models do exist between and that attempt to bridge the gap, but in my opinion, come up short due to the commitments to either pole. And I must add that upwards of 90% of NIH funding is earmarked for or in support of the disease model. So the rational choice model and disease model poles emerge and rely on a sort of presupposed nature-culture distinction and dichotomy. But the story of agency is far more complicated than, on one hand, notions reducible to reducing rationality to be universalized, and on the other, determinate biological mechanisms that undermine the respective persons and their sense of self-direction. The dichotomy. So Sylvia Winter's work on sociogeny, in tandem with emerging field of cultural neurosciences, complicate this dichotomy and take it to be a misinterpretation. Sociogeny, Winter explains, is a cultural construction of specific conscious mental states states specific to modes of subjective experience defining what it's like to be human. And the sociogenic principle is information encoding organizational principle that problematizes the assumed boundary between culture and one's nature. In simpler terms, the ways in which we experience ourselves as a human being is only through the mediation and the socialization processes of culture. Cultural neuroscience, broadly construed, seeks how psychological states map onto biological states. Winter provides an excellent analysis revealing why she refers to a biocentric conception of what it means to be human, and the limits scientific methodology from developing the language necessary to dissolve the dichotomy. In my view, Winter's sociogenic principle as a bridge expands the notion of agency by revealing it as culturally constituted, therefore necessarily implicating the constructed systems of relation. To put it simpler, agency as a context dependent and relational. Consequently, the rational choice model and disease model polarity seems to be a bit deficient when you think about it this way. Rational choice is functional within a context of culturally determinate positionalities and option set. Disease models lack engagement with the cultural neurosciences and the likes of Winter, who state that what it's like to be a person directly affects the poles of the opioid system, namely the therapeutic and adverse, which in turn, affect qualitative mental states. That is to say, these poles necessarily require cultural content in order to function as valuative orientations. Separation sort of makes sense if we're doing a logical analysis of the mechanisms, but outside of that, it's sort of useless. The notion of culturally constituted agency and its neurobiological correlates stand in direct conflict with the accepted norms underpinning rational choice models, which arguably is like the liberal ideology that's, like I said before, is convenient for legal and economic systems. Winter makes use of the accepted norm of adaptive advantage models from evolutionary biology and cultural anthropologists in her analysis, but I make the connection to modify and expand and accommodate the extension of person to non-human or other than human, thus dissolving dichotomy a bit more of adaptive advantage, and which is an organism's ontology and subsequent taxonomies that are curated for its own onto or phylogenetic adaptive advantages. So this adaptive advantages oriented principle is an ordering in terms of its own advantage and not an understanding with use of reflexive capacities. So in order to understand the sociogenic principle, thus what it means to have agency, to meet the inclusive standards necessary to understand what it means to have agency in the world, I draw upon the foundations underpinning resilience models found in Anishinaabe philosophy. In collaboration with ecologists in several Anishinaabe communities, they have shown how participatory relational understandings of what it means to be a part of the community can serve as a framework for understanding agency in a more robust sense. From this view, the adaptive advantage model is harmfully reductive, atomistic, human-centered to the extent that it is predicated on individualized ontogenetic and phylogenetic survival. In contrast, resilience models or renewal models are grounded in an interdependent sense of being that precedes individuation, as to say there never was a time an individual was a true individual. Individuals emerge from recognizing the implications of one's activities as a participant rather than a competitor. With this concession as the basis, a reciprocity-based responsibility to not individual or group survival, but instead the renewal of the mutual means of survival itself emerges as fundamental to our relations or ecosystem or moral ecology. If we take resilience model as an expansion of Winter's sociogenic principle as our starting point, as a bridge dissolving nature culture, agency is necessarily social, and any remedy to individual behavior, especially addiction, must be oriented primarily towards the community itself. The praxis of adaptive renewal creates a not individual change, but systemic and structural change, which are the conditions for the possibility of individual renewal and transformation, and in this case, recovery. This radically changes the way that we view responsibility and charges us to reevaluate the functionality of current concepts such as blameworthiness and culpability. And side note, sort of emerging, is the question, to what extent does this undermine the license of community to place the burden of responsibility solely or primarily on the shoulders of individual agents. And I, sort of have a start of a critique of how people try to answer that in the context of oppression. But meet you.